And before I get started here, I'll try to close up a little bit early so I can show you some of the things that we have done and we have available on our website relating to the Civil War and to statehood. We have an amazing amount of material. No matter where you're from, we probably have something related to your county or your community in regards to this process. This is the outline for our online statehood exhibit, which is centered around primary sources, like so many of our things. In other words, instead of reading what Joe Geiger has to say about how West Virginia was created, you read the words of the people who are deciding upon the name, deciding what to do about slavery, things like this. So all of these things are based upon primary sources. You can read the words of those people as they're making those decisions. Very important. Anyway, when you talk about the formation of West Virginia, the first place that you start, of course, is with East-West sectional strife. We certainly know that there were a lot of issues between Eastern and Western Virginia prior to the Civil War, and a lot of people believe that due to these reasons that it was inevitable that West Virginia was going to break away at some point. The most important one of these, of course, is voting rights and representation. In 1776, when Virginia was formed as a state, they wrote their first constitution, and in that constitution were some things that would bother Western Virginians. One of these is the fact that in order to vote, you not only had to be a white male, you had to be a white male landowner. You had to own land. And this certainly upset a lot of Western Virginians. Another thing that was in there is that most of your local and state officials, your governor, your sheriff, things like this, were appointed. They were appointed by the legislature, which was dominated by Eastern Virginians. Westerners believed that all officials should be elected, and eventually we will get to that. In terms of representation, obviously, Western Virginia didn't have a lot of representation according to that first Constitution because, in large part, we were very sparsely populated. That's natural. But as you move into the 19th century, as population west of the Blue Ridge Mountains continues to increase, you see cries from Western Virginians. We want more representation. We want changes to our Constitution. And in fact, what they sought to do was to hold another constitutional convention, write another constitution for the state of Virginia. Finally, in 1829, 1830, a constitutional convention meets. They do make some changes, but not the ones that Westerners want. You know, you still cannot vote unless you own land or you lease land. You still have your officials who are appointed rather than elected. You do see greater representation in Western Virginia, but Westerners were quite upset by this 1830 Constitution. As population in the West continues to grow, you see continued demands for yet another Constitution to be written. And indeed, we have a third pre-war Virginia Constitution written in 1851. And with this Constitution, really Westerners get pretty much everything they want. We now will elect our public officials. And in fact, you see the election of Joseph Johnson, who's the first governor from present-day West Virginia who's elected as governor. You have also all white males over 21 can vote. Representation now greater for Western Virginia. Bottom line is, with this 1851 Constitution, Western Virginians got pretty much what they wanted in terms of voting rights and representation. So this decade between 51 and 61 is really, you see closer relations than ever before between Eastern and Western Virginia. Certainly there are a few things that don't go away. And this has to do, again, with that Eastern-dominated legislature. When you think about education, Westerners believe that all children should receive a free education. Virginia, again, dominated by Eastern Virginians, like a lot of southern states, didn't believe it was the state's responsibility to pay for that education. So this is one. And the other one that's really big that continues to be a thorn for Westerners is internal improvement, specifically transportation. You know, you think about the sparsity of roads in West Virginia prior to the Civil War. You know, we know about those 3 turnpikes, the National Road. Think about the railroads. The B&O Railroad was the only railroad in present-day West Virginia at the time of the Civil War. You've seen a little branch line of the B&O from Grafton up to Parkersburg, but for the most part, this is it. And even in those years, just prior to the Civil War, you see complaints from Western Virginians about the fact that they're not getting enough support from that Eastern-dominated legislature to provide internal improvements, to provide better transportation, because everyone knows this is going to bring economic development and growth. So that's what we're waiting on. Slavery, and I'll close with that one. This is one of the misunderstood ones. You know, some folks believe that West Virginia broke away and became a new state because we were against slavery, that we thought slavery was an awful thing and it ought to be abolished. You know, part of that is true. Only 4% of Virginia's slaves were in present-day West Virginia. Okay, think about that. Of all of the slaves in Virginia, only 4% of them were in what became West Virginia. And we see different movements to end slavery. But very important to note that Western Virginians who oppose slavery don't oppose it because they think it's morally wrong. They oppose it due to economic and political reasons. This is why they oppose slavery. Very important to note, and I'll follow up on that when we talk about our Constitution. Anyway, so these are some of the issues between Eastern and Western Virginia at the time this 1860 election is held. Now, we actually have 4 candidates in this election. We know about Stephen Douglas, who had debated with Lincoln in 1858. The Democratic Party actually will split in this 1860 election. You'll actually have a Northern Democratic candidate, Douglas, and a Southern Democratic candidate whose name was John Breckinridge. He was the Vice President of the United States. We actually have another party, the Constitutional Union Party, that fields a man by the name of John Bell, who's kind of a moderate candidate. But we all know who wins. This big tall guy with the long beard and the big hat, Abraham Lincoln. And I don't think it was necessarily Lincoln himself, his election, that's going to start this whole crisis. It's the fact that he's a Republican, and that the Republican Party, part of their platform was a non-extension of slavery. Very important. We've been able to keep the peace in this country, keep civil war from happening by, finding compromises. Let's bring this state in as a free state, we'll bring this state in as a slave state, we'll keep the balance, everybody will be happy, and we'll go on as a country. Well, the Republicans are saying we're not going to have any more compromises. Any more states that are created from those western territories are going to be free states. From a southern perspective, this was a no-go. This meant that eventually slavery could be legislated out of existence, okay? So southern states had made it clear, a number of them, that if Lincoln was elected, they were going to secede or leave the Union. And indeed, that's what you see happen after his election. 7 states secede, they form the Confederate States of America, and then eyes begin turning on to Virginia. What will Virginia do? Now, it's very important to note all those early leaders. You think about the Washingtons and the Madisons and the Jeffersons, on, all those important, prominent American leaders. You think about our military leadership. Think about the geographical location. Think about it in relation to Washington, D.C. What Virginia does is going to be key. So what happens is the governor that we see down here, John Letcher, who was a moderate from the Shenandoah Valley, Letcher calls the legislature into a special session. And when they get together, they decide instead of taking this on themselves, they're going to call for a special convention to be held. We call this convention the Richmond Convention. It starts on February 13th, and you have 152 delegates who have been elected to represent the people of Virginia at this convention. And again, the purpose, determine what Virginia will do in this crisis. Well, very important to note that for the first couple of months, the majority of these delegates are moderate in nature. Certainly you have people from Western Virginia who say we can't go. You have other people from Eastern Virginia who are saying we need to secede now, we need to leave the Union. But the vast majority are moderate in nature. In fact, it's going to be 2 events that occur outside the convention that determine what Virginia will do. The first of these happens on April the 12th, and you're familiar with that, the attack on Fort Sumter, initiating the Civil War. And then 3 days later, President Lincoln issues a call for 75,000 troops to put down the rebellion. And this is the final straw for these folks. And I think it's difficult for us to understand the loyalty that one held to one's state as opposed to one's country. And that's going to be the big difference maker in this whole process. And I'll get back to that in a second. Anyway, on April 17th, a secret vote is taken, and the delegates pass what's known as the Ordinance of Secession. They say we are leaving the Union. This was by a vote of 85 to 55. As you might imagine, a lot of those no votes come from people from Western Virginia. But it's not official, and this is very important to note. Yes, we have The delegates have done this, but before it becomes official, the people have to approve. So on May 23rd, the people are going to go to the polls, and they're going to decide yay or nay on what their delegates have done here. Now, what I was getting back to, very important, when you look at the no votes, you find names like Jubal Early. You Civil War buffs out there, you heard of Jubal Early. He was a Confederate general, for Pete's sake. John Baldwin, who becomes a prominent. What I'm getting to is you have a number of Virginians who are patriots, who believe maybe that what they're doing here is wrong. Leaving the Union is wrong. So they vote against the ordinance of secession. But once it becomes a done deal, once it's official, they side with the Confederacy. That's very, very important to note. The difference for the people here in Western Virginia, those guys who proceed to create a state, is their loyalty lies first and foremost to their country. That's the big difference. Anyway, as I said, the vote's not going to take place until May 23rd. But before that happens, we've got all kinds of stuff going on. This man that you see up here is our good friend Big John Carlisle. John Carlisle was an attorney from Clarksburg. He'd been a congressman, and he had been very outspoken at that Richmond convention against leaving the Union. So much so, in fact, that his life was threatened. You had mobs that gathered outside his hotel room and threw a rope up over a tree and invited him to come down and try the new necktie they had for him. Carlisle was a threatened man, as were a lot of those delegates from Western Virginia. They had to get a safe conduct passage from the governor to make their way back to Western Virginia. But when Carlisle gets back here, he wastes no time. On April the 22nd, only 5 days after that vote is taken, a meeting is held in Clarksburg. We don't know a heck of a lot about it. We know 1,200 Union men gathered there, trying to determine what we're going to do as Union men, because our government has done something that we disagree with. Well, the big thing, and the reason we point to this as part of initiating the statehood process, is they call for a larger convention to be held. These 1,200 Union men who gather there in Clarksburg, they call for a bigger convention, more representative of the people of northwestern Virginia. So that's what's going to happen. First Wheeling Convention, as you can see, begins on May 13. Remember, that vote is coming on May 23, so it's only about 10 days before this vote is going to be taken. You have about 430 delegates that gather in Wheeling at the First Wheeling Convention. Very important to note how these people came to be delegates. You know, some of them were elected in a regular manner, like we tend to want to have. Some of them may have been appointed. Some of them may have had some vacation time and decided they wanted to be a delegate and showed up at the convention as well. In other words, this is one of the reasons why people question our constitutionality, having to do with the fact that a lot of our delegates, our representatives at these different meetings, were not elected in a representative fashion. This is one of the problems. And of course, one of the others is that all along the way, you have some counties who never have any representation. At this particular convention, about half of West Virginia's counties, about half of the counties that will become West Virginia, have representation, okay? On the second day, our good friend Big John Carlisle stands up and proposes the creation of a new state to be called New Virginia. Actually, we bought a New York Herald newspaper that actually had a little outline of that map of what that state would have been like. And it's really interesting to me because if we had stuck to that outline that Carlisle proposed, there probably wouldn't be as much controversy about our creation, because he stuck pretty much to that northwestern portion of present-day West Virginia. Carlisle's proposal was shot down. It certainly has some support, but most of the delegates point out the fact that it's not official yet. It's not until May 23rd that this becomes official. Let's wait and see what happens. Most importantly, let's go back and rally the people to vote against this ordinance of secession. However, if it passes, then we'll come back and decide what we're going to do next. Okay? May 23rd, the vote is taken. Now, these are the figures that were put up by the governor. As you can see, lopsidedly in favor of the ordinance of secession. In other words, the vast majority of Virginians wanting to leave the Union. A lot of Western Virginia officials kind of disputed this, said you didn't count our votes, so on and so forth. These are the figures I want you to think about. In our history textbooks for years and years, we saw the figures that 44,000 West Virginians voted against the ordinance of secession, and only 4,000 voted in favor. In other words, historians for decades put forth that by 11 to 1, We voted against the Ordinance of Secession. We don't know where these figures came from, but we know that they are quite wrong. This is a great book. Richard Curry, A House Divided. It was published back in '64, I believe. And Curry does a detailed study into how, we have, for a lot of counties, we might have a report that said Cabell voted against secession by a majority of 1,000 or something like that. So we may have some numbers, we don't have the exact voting numbers. But Curry kind of postulated some of these, looked at past elections, and these are the figures that he came up with. And I tend to believe that we're not going to find much that's going to give us a more clear picture. He believes that 34,000 plus West Virginians voted against the Ordinance of Secession, but something like 19,000 plus voted in favor. In other words, what he's saying is, yes, West Virginians voted against the Ordinance of Secession, but the numbers aren't nearly as drastically lopsided as we've been led to believe for generations. Very important to note. So now it's official. Virginia has left the Union. So as promised, that same election, or was it June 4th? I think on June 4th election, delegates are elected, probably about 90 delegates are elected, at this second Wheeling Convention. And this gets a little confusing here. We've got a first session and a second session. This is the first session. This runs from June 11th through the 25th. And the important thing to take away is that Carlisle, again pushing for separation, but quickly recognizes that yes, maybe I am still a little ahead of the game. What they decide instead is a different approach. In fact, what they do is they say what Virginia did, what our government in Virginia did, those guys in Richmond, in leaving the Union, was illegal. They vacated their offices. So what we're going to do is we're going to fill those offices. In other words, these guys, at this first session of the Second Wheeling Convention, they're not creating a new state. What they're doing is they're replacing a government. They are going to become the Union government of Virginia. Very important to note. They're going to be recognized by Congress. They're going to be recognized by President Lincoln, not as the government of West Virginia, but as the government for all of Virginia. And this is going to be so key in this process, as you'll see in just a little bit. They select a governor, Francis Pierpont. You've probably heard that name. Francis Pierpont, of course, was never the governor of West Virginia. He's known sometimes as the father of West Virginia, but he was never a governor of West Virginia. He was the governor of Virginia. Other officials are put into place. The legislature actually starts functioning as the government of Virginia. They select congressmen and senators. As you might imagine, Carlisle, yes?
Had the Commonwealth of Virginia repealed ratification of the Constitution by that point?
I'm not sure what the dates are on that. I know they continue to meet there in Richmond and continue to take steps. And you actually see a number of Western delegates who have voted no against the Ordinance of Secession who go back in and change their votes. Or they weren't there that day, so they wanted their vote recorded for history's sake. I'm not sure when the official steps were taken. I kind of lose it after that Ordinance of Secession is passed because everything moves back to Western Virginia for me. So anyway, one of those two U.S. senators that are selected is Carlisle, as you might imagine. The other is a guy by the name of Waitman T. Willie. And it's really funny. We've got a great editorial from the Wheeling paper that talks about, well, Big John, he's our man. We're awfully glad he's there. But this Willie guy, we're not real sure about him, which is really kind of ironic, as you'll see. August the 6th, that second Wheeling Convention reconvenes. And by this time, you have enough support, enough sentiment for the creation of a new state. And in fact, the delegates there, the reported from a committee, the delegates take a vote and approve the creation of a new state. What was to be called? Kanawha, exactly. The new state of Kanawha, 39 counties. And this was to be put to the voters on October the 24th of 1861. And given what I've told you about, we talked about the Confederate soldiers. Did I say Confederate soldiers? Okay, here's another figure. I'll throw that out at you. Again, our history books, we look at them and we want to find out, well, how did West Virginians serve in the Civil War? Did they serve for the Union or the Confederacy in terms of the troops? The figures we've always seen were something like 32,000 Union soldiers, 7,000 Confederate soldiers. Again, I'm not really sure where we got those figures, but they're wrong. Jack Dickinson at Marshall did a detailed study showing that there were at least 18,000 Confederates from present-day West Virginia. Also important to note that of those first West Virginia or Virginia units, many of them were from Ohio and Pennsylvania. Even though they're Virginia units, they're made up of soldiers. Those states had filled their quotas, and these guys are anxious to get in the war, so they sign up for the Virginia units. So my point being, I still believe that you had more Union soldiers than Confederates. But again, very important to note, there were a lot of Confederates from West Virginia. Now, given what I've told you about the vote on the Ordinance of Secession, the number of soldiers, you have to figure this vote on October 24th is going to be awfully close on whether or not we want to have this new state at all. When the vote total is counted, 18,408 in favor of the new state and 781 opposed. We'll have 3 elections during this statehood process, and this is the closest of the 3 votes. Again, another reason why people question our creation. And also, it's very important to note that of those 781, a lot of those no votes come from up in the northern panhandle. And you're like, well, that's obviously a very strong Union area. Why is that? I think part of it had to do with how we voted in these days. You know, you didn't get behind a screen and use your touch screen or whatever. You walked up to a table. These people were holding the election, and they said, "Do you want this new state or not?" And you start to answer, and you might notice that there were some Union soldiers lolling about, kind of listening on how you might vote, because they might show up at your house that night if you voted the wrong way. You might be on a list. You might be sent to Camp Chase or the Athenaeum. Very dangerous business, even voting in these days. And I think that certainly is very important to note when we look at these lopsided. What about all those Confederates? Well, we know Confederates, we know those 18,000 are off serving in the war. We know a lot of Confederates that are staying home or boycotting these elections. They're not going to have anything to do with it. We know a lot of areas are occupied. You know, we know Greenbrier County, you're not going to hold any elections in Greenbrier County. The Confederates occupy. And they're not going to say, come on in and hold your statehood vote. We'll let you. It's not going to happen. So these are, again, are all reasons why we question our creation. Anyway, so now it's official. The people have approved this new state, so we have to write a constitution. And this constitutional convention, pretty interesting. You have 50 to 60 delegates that gather there. One of the things that kind of fascinates me is the makeup of the convention. When you think about your leadership today, you probably would think it would be attorneys or businessmen or folks like this. A lot of the delegates at this constitutional convention were ministers and farmers. You know, it was different. It certainly was different. And you see some real interesting debates taking place over various issues. We'll talk about these 3 real quick. The naming of the state, obviously, Kanawha wasn't popular with everyone. You had someone stand up and say, "Mr. President, I vote we strike Kanawha," and all heck breaks loose. Because you have people who want Kanawha, obviously. They say it's the major river, and that's what we name it after. But you have other people who say it's confusing. We already have a couple of rivers named Kanawha. Charleston, known as Kanawha Courthouse. You can imagine writing your girlfriend a letter at Kanawha Courthouse, comma, Kanawha County, comma, state of Kanawha. Get a little confusing. But my favorite remarks in relation to the state name are from Willie himself. He talked about how hard it is to spell and to pronounce. And working here at the archives, any of us can tell you that if somebody calls asking for Kanawha County, chances are they're not from West Virginia. Who else would know how to pronounce Kanawha by looking at it? So Kanawha does get the boot. Then the big debate becomes over whether or not to include Virginia in this new name. And that's very interesting. You have a lot of people who say, look, that Eastern-dominated legislature has treated us poorly for many, many years. Let's break away, let's get a fresh start, let's have a new name, something different. But you had other people who said, we've been Virginians all our lives, it's not our fault, those people, you know, seceded and did all this. We deserve to keep that name as much as they do. So that, of course, is how we end up with West Virginia as the name. In terms of the boundaries, you actually have 32 additional counties that are proposed at various points along the way. A lot of these are tossed out because of large numbers of slaves, because of large Confederate population, you know, things like this. So eventually our outline is what we have today. I think there were 44 counties that were named, 7 others given the opportunity to come in whenever they could hold an election. And of those, only Frederick County, Virginia, does not vote to become a part of West Virginia. Slavery's the big one. You know, we touched on slavery just a little bit. And again, this is one of those things, I was just talking to this fellow in there, he's a constitutional law professor, and that's one of the things that he had heard, that West Virginia broke away because of slavery, because we thought it was wrong, and we thought we needed to have this new state. As you can see, nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, Gordon Patel over here on the top right, he was a Methodist minister from Wheeling, an abolitionist, and proposes gradual emancipation at various points during this Constitutional Convention. But boy, I'll tell you, the subject gets changed in a hurry whenever he hits the floor. These delegates don't want to deal with slavery. And in fact, what we have in our first Constitution, what it read, you know, the closest thing in relation to slavery, it said, no more African Americans, whether free or slave, will be permitted into West Virginia. Now that doesn't sound like a good abolitionist state to me. If we're just going to say no more black people are going to come here, and we're going to put that in our Constitution. Well, you know, this certainly was disturbing, but even more importantly, we've got a few more steps to go before West Virginia becomes a state. And one of those is going to Washington. And this war, this civil war that's going on, is becoming more than just a war to bring these seceded states back into the Union. It's also becoming a war about ending slavery. Growing power exerted by radical Republicans is making this a war about ending slavery. So it's obvious that this Constitution as it's written is not going to fly through Congress. But before we get there, we also had a township system put into place here. We had it for a short period of time, obviously. And then this Constitution is approved. The voters approve it, another close vote, 18,000 plus to 500 plus. And then comes the key to the whole process. Now, according to the United States Constitution, in order for a new state to be created from an existing state, the existing state has to give its permission. In other words, plug in the names. In order for West Virginia to be created from Virginia, Virginia has to give its permission. Well, that could be a problem. What do you think about that? I mean, you know, we've got a civil war going on. There's guys in Richmond. They're not going to be likely. Well, we've got an answer, don't we? We already have the restored government of Virginia, the Argo, is recognized by Washington as being the government of Virginia. They can give that permission. They can give that permission, and they do. And again, for people who question West Virginia's constitutionality, it usually comes back to this. You know, can this government truly claim to be the government for all of Virginia? Well, I think the answer is that the federal government recognized them as such, and so they were. Again, we're in the midst of a civil war. Things are a little bit different. Now we go to Washington. So you think you cleared all the hurdles. You go to Washington, and on May 29th, Waitman and Willie presents the statehood petition on the Senate floor. It's referred to committee, as usual. In this case, the Committee on Territories. And West Virginians probably rejoiced because a member of that Committee on Territories was our good friend, Big John Carlisle. So Carlisle takes on the task of writing up the statehood bill. Well, when he emerges 1 month later, West Virginians are shocked because he has done quite a bit to this Constitution. He has called for 15 additional counties to be added. He has called for gradual emancipation to be put into this Constitution, and he's called for an entirely new Constitution to be written. In other words, that Constitutional Convention has to get back together and start from scratch. It's obvious to West Virginians that Big John Carlisle, who's been at the forefront of the statehood movement, is now doing everything he can to sabotage it. Well, do we know why? I'm not entirely sure. You know, this is one of those things that's puzzled historians. Probably the most accepted belief is that Carlisle turned against it because he was a strict constitutionalist. He believed that, yes, Congress has the obligation to approve West Virginia's statehood or vote it down, but they don't have the ability to go in and change things, which kind of, you know, leads me to question, well, why did you go and change things, John? So, you know, it's not really clear, but it's evident that Carlisle is very much, and he's not alone. Very important to note that here. We have a lot of Union people, Union supporters who have supported the Argo, but once it becomes a push for a new state, they're against it. They're still Union men, but they're against West Virginia. And this is fascinating because you read the Willie Intelligencer. A quick note that the Intelligencer is, you know, the guy who edited that, Archibald Campbell. We call him a statehood maker, even though he's just a newspaper editor, because he was leading the way. He was basically saying this is the way it is. Well, Campbell, you know, any Union man who questioned West Virginia suddenly became a traitor. You know, they were called out, and it's just fascinating to read this and think, well, how could you say that? But anyway, Carlisle's proposals are dumped. Charles Sumner proposes immediate emancipation, and this gets dumped as well. The saving grace is going to be our good friend Wakeman T. Willie, who the Willie Intelligencer questioned him being there at all. Willie comes up with a Willie Amendment in conjunction with Ohio Senator Ben Wade. Essentially, the Willie Amendment provides for gradual emancipation, okay? And this is going to be enough to get it through the U.S. Senate. But very important to note that it doesn't abolish slavery. West Virginia will enter the nation as a slave state. It's not until February 3rd of 1865 that we actually abolish slavery here in West Virginia. Anyway, votes taken, 23-17 in favor of West Virginia in the United States Senate. Our good friend Big John Carlisle votes against it. Pretty amazing. It goes to Congress, 96-55 on December 10th. It passes the House of Representatives, and then it gets to our good friend Abraham Lincoln. And I don't think Lincoln was thrilled with getting the statehood bill in his lap. Certainly he approved of the Argo. I think he saw the Argo as maybe a model or a template that could be used during this Reconstruction period. We've got to bring these states back in. How are we going to do it? Well, maybe we can model it on what we've done in Virginia. But when it becomes a push for separation, for an entirely new state, I think this bothered him quite a bit because, again, his primary objective is bringing those states back into the Union. How's Virginia going to react when you've taken away a big chunk of their territory and created a new state? Obviously, they're going to be less likely to want to come back into the Union. So I think he was bothered by West Virginia's statehood. He sent it to his cabinet with two questions. Is it constitutional and is it expedient? And like all good cabinets, they came back split 3-3, so it was back into his lap. Lincoln is getting pestered to death by West Virginia representatives, delegates, governors, such. You know, when are you going to sign this thing? You know, when are you going to sign this thing? We have to remember a civil war's going on. The Civil War could end at any time, and if statehood's not there, these guys are out of luck. Not only that, they're going to be in hot water with their brethren down in Richmond, aren't they? So, one of them, Congressman Jacob Beeson Blair, shows up, asks Lincoln about it, and Lincoln says, well, come back tomorrow and I'll have a present for you. So that was on New Year's Eve. On New Year's Day, 1863, Blair shows up at the White House, and it's too early to get in through the front door, so he crawls in through a window and sits down there and waits. Now, don't try that. Any of you at home, don't try that. Don't try crawling through the window of the White House. But he waits for Lincoln, and Lincoln comes down, opens up the desk drawer, and shows him the signed statehood bill. Now, just a couple more steps that occur before that. It has to go back to the Constitutional Convention. They reconvene long enough to add the Willie Amendment, the gradual emancipation clause in, and strike that offensive phrase about no more black people being permitted into the state. Once this is done, Lincoln issues his proclamation on April 20th of 1863, and 60 days later, West Virginia becomes the 35th state in the Union. This is actually a J.H. Distabar sketch. Distabar, of course, is the guy who designed our state seal. He did this sketch of Gorman delivering his inaugural address on June 20th, so that's pretty cool. Just a couple of notes. As I said, I believe that without the Civil War, we probably wouldn't have a West Virginia. Why is that? Well, I think about the Argo. I think there's no other way that you would have a situation in which the restored government of Virginia would have to be created. They're the ones who give that permission. So without the Civil War, no Argo. Without the Argo, no West Virginia. Is there a time, and I guess this is the question, is there a time after the Civil War when Virginia ever would have said, yes, go ahead, break away Western Virginia with your timber and your coal and become a new state? We're okay with that. I find it hard to believe that they ever would have. I also think about the fact that Lincoln in Congress, Lincoln makes it very clear in his opinion that what he's doing is not to be seen as a precedent for peacetime. These are special circumstances. West Virginia becomes a state in the Union because of very special circumstances. These guys were absolutely determined to create a new state, all of those grievances from the past, and this presents them with an opportunity that they might not ever have had otherwise. And of course, that military protection, we oftentimes just overlook the importance of that. The fact that, the Battle of Philippi shortly after that campaign, the Battle of Rich Mountain in July of 1861. With that, a large portion of present-day West Virginia was protected, okay? Very important to note. That military protection, sure, we still have guerrilla warfare and all that stuff going on, but the folks up at Wheeling who are proceeding to create a union government for Virginia and later a new state of West Virginia, they're protected. And why is that important? It's 2 words, John Brown. You recognize that name. What was John Brown convicted and hanged for in 1859? Treason. Treason against the state of Virginia. Now, you look at what these folks are doing up in Wheeling and creating an alternative government of Virginia and then creating West Virginia and taking a chunk of that away. What are they doing? They're committing treason against the state of Virginia. So if it had not been for that military protection, chances are they would have been hanging from lampposts throughout Wheeling. Okay? That's my opinion. I'll quit rambling and be glad to take a question or two. I know we're just here, so waiting on cake. So, yes, Ms. Schwab.
When Virginia came back to the Union, didn't they then sue West Virginia or something? There was something about reparations that we had to pay?
Well, 2 different things there. There was a suit to bring Jefferson and Berkeley counties back as a part of Virginia, and that did not succeed. Kind of a technical kind of thing. They didn't rule. That's as close as we've come to a ruling on the constitutionality of West Virginia. The other was the Virginia debt case. That was something where, and we had noted as such in our Constitution that, in the years that we were part of Virginia, we had incurred debt. We built roads, we built banks, whatever it might be, state money. So as part of our share of that debt, we had a settlement that we reached with Virginia, and I think the last payment was made in 1939, I believe, but we finally paid them off. Yes, ma'am.
You call him Big John, was that because he was physically?
No, I'm just making, that's
Okay.
just being silly, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Yes, sir.
I know that when West Virginia was formed, Pierpont and the administration claiming to be for the whole state of Virginia moved to outside of D.C., I guess Alexandria. What role did they play? I know they lost their representation in Congress, but when the war ended, were they recognized as a legitimate government?
Yes, as soon as West Virginia is created, they continue functioning. They moved to Alexandria, as you said, and they continue to function as the government of Virginia until the war concludes. At that point, Pierpont and his gang moved down to Richmond. They functioned as the government of Virginia until about 1868, in fact. So, it's part of that whole Reconstruction process that he'll actually be there in office. I think they put a military person in there for a short period, and then Virginia comes back in. And once they're redeemed, I think is the word that was used, then they're able to handle their own affairs. But before that, Pierpont actually functions as their government. Yes, sir.
There's a gentleman who's going to be here tomorrow for the next lecture, a newspaper guy, and he said that his research found that in the West Virginia Constitution, there was a provision to pay down or to incur part of that antebellum debt that you're talking about. Why on earth, if these guys were calling the shots, why on earth would they have memorialized in a Constitution to pay down the debt of the Commonwealth from which they got very little benefit in terms of the improvements?
That's a great question. I have no idea why it was included in the Constitution in terms of dealing with it at all. I think they probably recognized that they had a responsibility for a part of that debt and they were willing to pay, although Virginia did have to sue them to get that process started.
Well, the gentleman's going to be here tomorrow. He maintains that he thinks that as part of Lincoln looking forward to Reconstruction and trying to soothe the ill feelings that you talked about, creating the state of West
That
Virginia.
Lincoln wanted that provision in the Constitution?
That was his take. It was kind of a payoff to the Commonwealth in anticipation of Reconstruction.
Huh, that's very interesting. Yes, sir, Greg.
You did notice that at the bottom of the Willie Amendment, it says no new slaves to be brought into the new state of West Virginia. That leaves a very questionable area of free people of color. It also makes you wonder what they were doing with, in quotes, contraband, escaping slaves that are leaving Virginia, leaving Tennessee, leaving North Carolina, and coming up into Western Virginia. Of course, we'll never know the figures on that, but it clearly lets open a area for free people of color, you know,
Absolutely.
because they aren't slaves.
Yeah, that's a fascinating period. It would be great if you had the records and the time to detail. I mean, you're not talking about a lengthy period of time, really, that from the time West Virginia becomes a state until February 3rd of 1865. What was the condition, not just of the free people of color, but also what about slaves? I mean, how were they treated? How many were still remaining? How many were not affected by the Willie Amendment? You know, we were intentionally excluded in the Emancipation Proclamation. We were actually spelled out as being excluded. So, you know.
Isn't it true that the Emancipation Proclamation did not free slaves in the northern states, in the Union states, only in the seceded states?
The other, yes, sir.
The convention was completely in front of the oil money. And our first governor, our first senator, our first congressman, all over. How significant it was protecting oil interests in our country?
I'm not sure. Certainly Dave McCain believes that that's one of the reasons why we were created. I don't know. It's hard to believe that it would have been the key simply because the oil industry was so new. I mean, 59 is when they struck the first well there at Burning Springs, I believe, so it was still all relatively new. Certainly, as you've noted, some of the most powerful people in the decision-making process were in the oil industry.
There were a few millionaires that made the United States in a short period.
Yes, sir. That's a great point.
Could it be because a lot of your settlers in that part of the area came from Pennsylvania and New York, they came in that way, whereas down here in the South, we all came from Virginia. I know lots of people, I mean, you look to Virginia.
I think that's a good point. And actually, at the Constitutional Convention, one of the things I point out to my students is, you know, you look at their occupations. I talked about the farmers and ministers and such. What's also interesting is where they were from. You know, you didn't have any of the delegates who were from Alabama or North Carolina or whatever. They were either from Virginia or they were from northern states. They were from Massachusetts. They were from New York. They were from northern states. So I don't know if that ties in at all. I found that kind of interesting. That certainly, John Williams, I saw something in the paper today about him talking about the southernification or something of West Virginia.
Well, on that, I was going to have you comment on the voting percentages later, by 1875, 1876. Suddenly, with Confederate soldiers allowed to vote,
Yeah,
the people that created our state are voted out.
Yeah, that's an outstanding point, and again, it's really reflective of the divided Senate. 1866, a constitutional amendment was passed that essentially stripped ex-Confederates of their citizenship rights. They couldn't vote, they couldn't practice law, they couldn't teach school, they couldn't sue people, they couldn't serve on juries. Essentially, let's say 25,000 ex-Confederates were prevented from voting. These guys who created West Virginia were desperate to hang on to their power. You had other people who by 1868 are saying we need to have some kind of let-up policy. Very important. You know, Confederates, Democrats, you know, statehood makers, Republicans, okay? So as time goes on, they're trying to find a way. How are we going to do this? You know, if we let all these ex-Confederates vote, they, in conjunction with our Union people who don't agree with us, are going to vote us out of power. Well, I won't go into the whole complicated mess, but in the election of 1870, ex-Confederates do vote and do come back into power. And within 2 years, they have an entirely new constitution. This is one of my favorite stories. Remember our hero, Wakeman T. Willie. Wakeman T. Willie, when this Constitutional Convention is held in 1871, 1872, to essentially wipe out the statehood constitution and put in an entirely new one, Wakeman Willie was one of 12 Republicans as opposed to 66 Democrats at this Constitutional Convention. He's a backbencher. He's sitting on the back bench, probably just said, "Oh my gosh, not another one." You know, and reflective of the Senate is you had proposals to change the new counties that had been created. Lincoln County, let's change that to Davis County after Jefferson Davis. Let's change Grant County to Lee County after Robert E. Lee. Again, reflective of the dramatic change that takes place only a few years after West Virginia statehood has achieved. It's just amazing. Any other questions?
I didn't realize that West Virginia had those laws. I thought that you couldn't vote and all that was only to the southern states, and West Virginia avoided it because of being a northern state.
Yeah, you would think because of she's talking about Reconstruction, obviously. And there's a great book that's coming out, John Staley, about this whole period. It's going to be fascinating to read. But West Virginia's Reconstruction period was really painful as well. And I think part of that had to do with the fact that we were so badly divided. Yes, it was a Union state, but it had so much Confederate sentiment in there. And so that I don't know how people came back and got along. Truthfully, that's the most fascinating thing to me. You think about the Civil War, you think about the big battles. Well, that happens here in West Virginia on occasion. But the guerrilla warfare, the neighbor against neighbor, and then how in the heck, after coming over to your house and burning your barn, and you showing up the next day and hauling my son off to prison, how are we going to come back and live next to one another and do barn raisins and all this, corn huskings and all this stuff together? It's just amazing that the people were able to come back together. I would just say in closing that regardless, to me, this is unique. I think some of our early historians were a little embarrassed, a little defensive about how we were created. And that's why we get these lopsided numbers. Say, oh, we were all good Union men. Oh, we thought slavery was awful. All this stuff. This is the real story. The divisiveness of the war period. To me, that's what makes it so fascinating. It's unique. It's ours. It's West Virginia's history, and no one else has one like it. So, happy birthday, right? Do we have a couple minutes?
Sure.
Let me just show you something. You don't have to stay if you don't want, but just show you something real quick that we've done in relation to our sesquicentennial. Again, this is something that you can view from home, but we did a lot of different projects. And you can find it all on our front page. Easiest thing to do, if you just go to Google and type in West Virginia history, we should be the first thing that comes up, unless that dastardly Wikipedia has bumped us for the day. This is our webpage. This is what it will look like. You'll see that Welcome West Virginia Archives and History. If you scroll down here, this fifth link down says Child of the Rebellion and Archives and History Sesquicentennial. I think Brian came up with that Child of the Rebellion, which is a great title because that's extracted from a quote that Arthur Gorman gave in his inaugural address. I think it's a great title. This is our page for all the sesquicentennial stuff. Here's that online statehood exhibit I was telling you about. It was done a good while back, so it's kind of buried here. Mary Johnson did an outstanding exhibit on John Brown, again, centered around primary sources. But the stuff that we did specific to the sesquicentennial, Terry Lowry just finished up two very nice things. The annotated bibliography, which has a list of all the books that we have here in the archives relating to the Civil War. And then Terry just recently did one that details all of these special collections, all the manuscripts that we have relating again to the Civil War. So that's very useful for researchers. This timeline is something that we did kind of as a follow-up to our On This Day, where we tried to find an event that occurred every day 150 years ago and found primary sources to kind of blow those up. Again, if you click on one of these, I don't know if we'll have anything here. There's a newspaper account from the Richmond Dispatch. We have official records. We have letters. Just different things like that, again, that we did for each day. The other thing that's very useful, you'll see we have some biographies of people there, some of our statehood. Our sesquicentennial moments, which appeared in newspapers. Mary Johnson, somewhere here, did a good bit of work there. Mary right over there. And P.J. Dickershot up there. These are pretty cool. Just little blurbs of things that were done, again, as teaching tools that we can use. Or not. It's there, I promise. Yeah. So that's kind of cool. One of those little things. My favorite, though, Jerry Brady, who was a retired teacher and who was a volunteer, passed away tragically a year or so ago, scanned thousands of militia letters. Now, we also have there, you see, recruiting officers, list of African American soldiers from West Virginia. Greg, I think that came from that 45th stuff. This is the, there they are. Union militia letters. I love these letters. You can actually just read them. I've got this one highlighted for a reason, I guess. But you can go here, click on one of the folders, click on it, and you can actually view the letter. I think it's easier to look at the letter online than it is to hold it in your hands sometimes. But you can see this is actually a very detailed letter about a skirmish that took place. And to me, this is a great teaching tool, too, for students, because, my gosh, they think cursive is like French. I've never seen this cursive language stuff. So simply giving them a letter and letting them transcribe it is a pretty cool teaching tool.
Yeah, it's by sitting back, all the way in the back.
What'd you say,
can actually
Patsy?
sit and read it from back here.
You can?
Yeah.
Yeah,
The
it's pretty
printing
nice.
and stuff, when it's very clear, you can almost read it from
Yeah.
back here.
It's really neat, though, to actually look at those original documents.
It is.
Anyway, we've got a ton of stuff on there. If you've got any questions about any of it, let me know, or Mary, or webmaster. And thank you so much for coming out today. I sure appreciate it.
Take time.
I guess it is time for the cake.